Autumn 1866, New Mexico Territory. Autumn crept over the New Mexico Territory like rust on a forgotten blade, slow, quiet, and irreversible. The year was 1866, just a breath after the smoke of war had settled back east, but out here in the sun-scorched borderlands, peace was just another lie whispered over whiskey and poker chips. Tucked along a cracked trade route where the desert sand swallowed tracks, overnight sat a ghost-bitten town called La Sombra Ridge. No rail reached it, no telegraph sang to it. Just a handful of clapboard buildings held up by termites and prayer, and the wind, hot, dry, full of secrets, scraping through the alleys like it was looking for something it lost. Behind the old cantina and beneath the broken awning of Ortiz Freight and Mules, a boy worked in silence, unloading crates by moonlight. He was 19, tall but underfed, and had eyes the color of river stone, unreadable, worn smooth by hardship. His name was Callan Ward, but no one said it out loud. They just called him Boy, even though he hadn't been one for years. He was a stranger to this town, but not to pain. 6 years ago, he'd ridden into La Sombra Ridge clinging to the back of a rotting supply wagon beside a man who coughed blood every few feet. That man, Elias Ward, gambler, liar, and the closest thing to a father Callan, had died 3 days later under the steps of the Adobe Mission, clutching a half-won poker chip and a stomach full of cheap mezcal. No burial. No priest. Just a body and the flies it drew. Callan didn't cry. He just watched. And when no one came, he stole a shovel and dug a hole behind the cemetery wall where only the vultures bothered to mourn. That night, he sat by the shallow grave and whispered the only thing Elias ever taught him worth keeping. Don't wait for mercy. Trade in teeth or silence. From then on, Callan made himself useful to the wrong kind of people. He learned the desert by boot and bruise. He watched the cartel runners pass through, the bounty men on half-dead horses, the silent ones with long coats and eyes like carved stone. He earned food where he could, slept where knives stayed sheathed, and said little unless coin or danger required it. By 17, he could track a man across rock by a scuffed heel. By 18, he knew which kind of bullet left which kind of wound. Now, at 19, he was the only one in town the old muleteers didn't curse or cheat, not because they liked him, but because they feared the quiet ones. Still, Callan didn't dream of staying. La Sombra Ridge was a dead man's town, the kind that pretended to be asleep so death would pass it by. He kept his head low and his ears open, waiting for a day when the past wouldn't bleed into the present. That day never came. But the woman did. It began the way most trouble did, with strangers and silver. Callan was fixing a broken wheel axle behind the cantina when he heard voices from the front room, voices too clean for this part of the territory. Soft eastern accents. One nasal, one smooth. They didn't belong here, which meant they were here for something or someone. She won't speak a word, but she sees everything, one voice said behind the thin clay wall. Keep her whole. Deliver her by next week. You'll get your 2,000. Callan paused, eyes narrowing. There was a beat of silence. Then the other voice added, if she runs, bury her quiet. That night, he didn't sleep. The desert wind howled like a thing alive, rattling the loose boards of the freight barn where Callan kept his tools and thoughts. He sat by the lantern, sharpening a blade that didn't need sharpening, his mind chasing fragments. She won't speak, 2,000, bury her. Why would a woman be worth that kind of money? And who the hell wanted her silenced? The next morning, she arrived. The stagecoach limped into town at sunrise, trailing dust like a dying animal. She stepped down last. Tall, with raven-dark hair tied behind her head in a braid too neat for the frontier. Her shawl was faded, but her spine was straight. And though her lips never moved, her eyes met everything. When she looked at Callan, just for a heartbeat, he felt it. That sharp, cold pull of recognition. Not of face, but of kind. Survivors. Ones who didn't wait to be saved because they learned young that no one comes. She didn't speak to the driver. Didn't answer the saloon keeper's leer. Just walked down the main strip and out past the edge of town, toward a burned-out chapel that hadn't seen a prayer since the war started. Callan watched her go until the dust swallowed her silhouette. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped blood-red behind the buttes, Smoke rose from the chapel's chimney. Thin, controlled. Not desperate. She was cooking something. Or signaling someone. The town talked. The drunkard said she was a witch. The priest's widow claimed she was a war widow gone mad. The cantina crowd placed bets on how long before she disappeared like the last quiet stranger. But Callan knew better. She wasn't running. She was waiting. And if those eastern men came to claim her, they'd find La Sombre Ridge had one soul still willing to fight. Because in her silence, Callan had seen something impossible. Not fear, not desperation. And for the first time in years, he was afraid. Not for himself. For her. The first real rain of autumn came in the night, pounding the clay earth into thick mud. It washed away the bloodstains outside Clara's barn, but not from Eli's memory. He sat awake in the dark corner of the room she'd given him, bare wooden walls, a cot, and the scent of old tobacco and wool. Not much, but more than he deserved. Clara didn't ask many questions. Not at first. But silence can only hold so long before it cracks. She brought him breakfast that morning, coffee strong enough to burn through guilt, and cornbread with wild honey. She set it on the crate beside his cot, then stood with arms crossed, her apron damp from milking. "You plan on telling me who's after you?" Eli looked up, eyes rimmed in red. "Does it matter?" "It does if I'm standin' between you and a bullet." He exhaled, slow and bitter. "It was a job. Freight run out of Santa Fe. I rode with men who didn't know how to stay lawful. One night, 2 of them decided gold moved faster without witnesses. I didn't pull the trigger, but I didn't stop it neither. The army pinned it all on me." Clara's gaze didn't soften. "So what are you? Guilty man looking for shelter? Or an innocent man looking for pity?" Eli met her stare. "I'm a tired man looking for somewhere to die where no one remembers my name." She looked at him a long time. Then turned and walked out. But she left the coffee. Clara found him in the field 2 days later, sleeves rolled, shoulders bent, fixing the broken fence that bordered her property. The same fence her late husband once mended. She didn't stop him. Didn't tell him to rest. Let him sweat under the New Mexico sun until dusk bled into the horizon like a wound that wouldn't close. When he finally stumbled back to the house, she handed him a jar of water. "You swing that hammer like you're building your own grave." Eli drank deep, then wiped his mouth. "Ain't that what fences are? Keeping the world out, or keeping you in?" She didn't answer. Just walked inside. But that night, she didn't lock the door. Word spread, as it always does in places with more dust than people. The saloon owner, Luther Bell, saw him pass through town. Recognized the lean frame and the limp that never healed. The wanted posters had faded with the years, but memory had not. Sheriff Rollins showed up just before sundown. Broad-chested, thick-jawed, and carrying the weight of too many buried friends. "You're harboring a fugitive," he said to Clara. She stood at her porch, flower on her dress, a shotgun in her arms. "And you're standing on private land without a warrant," she replied. "You're making a mistake, Miss Rowan." "I've made worse," she said. "Like Mari, a man who came back from war meaner than he left. At least this one works and doesn't beat the stock." Rollins spit into the dirt. "You know I'll be back." She nodded. "Bring a warrant next time. Or a coffin." The sheriff left without looking back. That night, Eli sat by the fire, staring into the flames like they were speaking a language he'd once forgotten. "You should have let them take me," he murmured. Clara stirred the stew. "You're not a dog to be thrown out with the bones." "I killed a man, Clara." She turned slowly. "So did I." The words landed like a thud between them. "My husband," she said, voice dry. "He came back from the war broken. Took it out on me, on the animals, on himself. One night he put hands on me and didn't stop. I used a shovel. Buried him behind the barn. Told folks he went out looking for work. They believed me. Because no one wants to ask the questions they already know the answers to." Eli said nothing. What could he? 2 ghosts, seated across from each other, each wearing flesh and sin like borrowed coats. Weeks passed. The sheriff didn't return. Maybe because he had no proof. Maybe because Luther Bell had his own debts to pay. Or maybe because some part of New Mexico still respected blood debts over courtrooms. But Eli didn't feel safe. Not truly. Because safety meant roots. And roots meant something to lose. He took to sleeping in the barn again. Every night he heard the coyotes in the hills, howling like mourners. Every morning he fixed what was broken: shingles, hinges, rusted tools. He did it not for forgiveness, but because it made the silence bearable. Clara didn't speak of the shovel again. She didn't need to. Her hands said enough when she passed him a tin cup. When she left half a blanket on the porch swing. When she stood beside him while the sun dropped behind the red ridges and said, "That's a good day's work." It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was mercy. And in Eli's world, that was rarer than gold. One evening, as frost crept across the earth, a rider appeared at the edge of the horizon. Dark hat, long coat. Eli stiffened at the sight of him. Not Law. Worse. One of the men from the freight job. Alive. And coming straight for them. Eli reached for the rifle leaning by the barn door. Clara stepped outside and followed his gaze. She didn't ask questions. She didn't scream. She only said, "If he rides that far and don't turn back, he's come to kill or be killed." Eli chambered around. And nodded. The rider didn't stop at the gate. Dust swirled around his silhouette like a devil come to collect. He rode hard, a skinny, battle-bitten sorrel horse kicking up gravel in wide, angry flanks. Eli stood stone still beside the trough, rifle in hand, watching the past approach. Clara didn't speak. She stood behind the porch railing, her shotgun resting at her side, eyes narrowed like she could smell trouble long before it spoke. The rider slowed just enough to swing off the saddle, boots slamming into the dirt like he wanted everyone to know he'd arrived. "You still breathe, Eli McGraw?" the man barked. Eli raised his chin. Jonas. Jonas Lark. A name Eli hadn't said aloud in 4 years. The man wore rusted spurs and a grin full of bad memories. His coat hung open to show the pistol tied to his thigh. Too low to be casual. Too visible to be polite. "You were supposed to be buried outside Yuma," Jonas said, stepping closer. "But I hear you've been playin' house with a widow out in sagebrush country." "Wrong house," Eli replied flatly. "You lost your welcome 4 years ago." Jonas spat near the trough. "You walked away with a bounty on your head and your share of the haul. Men like me got left behind with nothing but scars and the marshal on our heels. I walked away because we killed a child." Jonas flinched just for a second. Then the grin returned. "You always were the soft one, Eli. A real poet with blood on his boots." Behind Eli, Clara stepped forward. "That all you came here to say?" Jonas's eyes flicked to her, and the amusement faded from his face. "No," he said. "I came to collect what I'm owed." Eli didn't move. "You came alone?" Jonas shook his head. "No one's that dumb. But they ain't far behind." He reached into his coat slowly. Clara raised her gun. Eli lifted his rifle halfway. Jonas froze. "Just a letter. Easy now." He pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper and tossed it at Eli's feet. "Names, dates, trails we took. I give this to the marshal, your name's on every line. I figured I'd offer you a way out first." Eli crouched slowly, picked up the paper. "You want gold," he muttered. Jonas grinned. "That cave near Calico. I know you know where it is. We all ran before we could collect the last stash." Eli looked up. "And if I don't help you?" Jonas's eyes turned cold. "Then your little safe haven burns before winter." He turned, swung back into the saddle, and spat once more. "You got 1 week. Then I send your name to every bounty hunter west of El Paso." He rode off into the dust, same way he came. Eli watched him vanish. The silence that followed was thicker than gun smoke. That night, Clara found Eli sitting alone on the porch. No lamp. Just moonlight and desert stillness. "He won't wait a week," she said. Eli nodded. "I know." She sat beside him. Folded her arms. "I won't ask what kind of man you were before this. But I can see what kind you're trying to be now." Eli kept his eyes on the horizon. "I got out once. Thought I could live quiet. Grow old fixin' fences and patchin' roofs. And then someone rode in and reminded you the past don't bury easy, Clara said. He finally looked at her. You sure you want me stay in here? She didn't answer right away. This land's hard. But so am I. If men like Jonas think they can ride through here and take what they want, they got another thing comin'. She stood, turned toward the house, and added over her shoulder. But if you're gonna stay, I suggest you start digging firing positions by sunrise. The week passed like a countdown. Eli and Clara built barricades from fence rails and hay bales. He cut slits into the barn walls for shooting angles. She filled jars with kerosene and stashed them near the porch. And in between all that, something else happened. They talked. Over stew. Over whiskey. Over silences that didn't feel empty anymore. He told her about his little brother, how he died in a mining collapse when Eli was 13. She told him how her husband used to drink, and how one night, after the bruises got too dark to hide, she picked up the rifle and made a widow of herself. They didn't trade pity, just truth. And when the coyotes howled at the edge of the property that last night, Eli looked out at the horizon and knew. They were coming. At dawn, the desert held its breath. A faint orange glow crept across the ridge. The chickens were silent. Even the wind dared not stir the brittle grass. Eli stood by the barn with his rifle slung over his back, eyes trained on the horizon. Clara was by the house, double-checking the glass jars filled with kerosene and cloth. One spark and they'd become hellfire. Eli whispered, "They'll come from the south. Easier to circle the ravine." Clara didn't reply. She was too busy tucking a pistol into her boot. They'd barely slept the night before. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was the calm before thunder. Each knew what they were willing to do for the other now. And each knew the other wouldn't run. Then the first rider appeared, a black horse moving like a phantom across the dusty plain. 2 more followed. Then 4. 8 men in total. Jonas rode at the front, coat flapping, a bandana pulled across his face. He raised his hand, and the group slowed about 30 yards out. "Last chance, Eli," he shouted. "Come out now and we'll leave the woman breathing." Clara raised her rifle over the porch rail and fired. The shot cracked like a whip. One of the men flinched back, his hat flying into the dirt. Shouts exploded. Gunfire answered. The siege had begun. Eli fired from the barn, hitting low. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. Clara's second shot punched through a man's shoulder, spinning him off his horse. Screams followed. One rider made it to the hay pile and lit a torch, but before he could throw it, Eli dropped him with a round straight through the thigh. Jonas was yelling orders now. 3 men flanked left, trying to circle the house. Clara ducked and ran inside, emerging moments later with a lit jar of kerosene. She tossed it into the brush behind the flanking men. It exploded in a bloom of fire. Horses screamed. The men scattered, their plan ruined. Jonas cursed, ducked behind a boulder, and emptied his revolver at the porch. Eli reloaded calmly. "I told you to stay gone, Jonas." A bullet cracked past his ear. Jonas bellowed back, "You should have died in that canyon. But here we are." More gunfire. Clara rolled from the porch to the side of the water trough and fired again. One of Jonas's men clutched his neck and fell. Now there were 6. Jonas cursed and pulled back. He called to the remaining men, "We ain't dying over buried silver." "You're not getting the map either." Eli shouted. Jonas hesitated, just long enough for Eli to see it. "The fear." Clara shouted, "Leave while you still got legs." Jonas backed toward his horse. "This ain't over, Eli. You can't outrun who you were." "No," Eli said, "but I can end what we started." Another shot rang out. Clara had fired again, this time at the saddlebag Jonas had slung over his horse. It tore open, spilling coins and paper across the dust. Jonas kicked his horse hard and galloped off. The others followed, limping, bleeding, cursing, but alive. The silence afterward felt heavier than the storm. Eli stood among the broken boards and blood-stained dirt. He stared at the bullet hole that had punched through the barn wall a breath away from where he'd been standing. Clara walked over, her face streaked with dust and sweat. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "You." She pulled the pistol from her boot. I think I broke a toe diving behind the trough. Eli let out a soft laugh, short, almost surprised. They stood side by side, surrounded by smoke and the smell of gunpowder. I guess they'll be back, Clara said, her voice low. Eli looked toward the south ridge, where dust still lingered. No, he said. Jonas is a coward, not a martyr. He came for silver, not a grave. She tilted her head. So it's over? He looked at her, really looked. At the way she stood unshaken. The grit in her eyes. The blood on her knuckles. No, he said. But maybe it's beginning. That night, they buried the man Clara shot through the neck. No name, no words. Just a shallow grave behind the barn and a small wooden cross. Eli didn't sleep. Neither did she. They sat on the porch again, backs against the wall, watching the stars stretch out across the horizon. You know, Clara said after a long silence, you never did tell me why you turned on your crew back then. Eli exhaled. There was a farmhouse. Middle of nowhere. We'd raided a stagecoach and were hiding out. Some kid came out, thought we were lost travelers. Jonas shot him just to see how far he'd fall. Clara's face hardened. After that, I couldn't ride with devils anymore. She nodded slowly. And now? He met her eyes. Now I'm trying to build something good with what's left. Clara reached over and touched his hand. Rough against rough. Broken meeting broken. You already started, she said. The morning after the siege, the world felt strangely still. The desert, always a place of echoes and ghosts, now held its silence like a hymn. Eli swung the axe in rhythm beside the old shed, chopping broken furniture for firewood. Every swing was deliberate, not out of anger, but purpose. Beside him, Clara sifted through a box of rusted tools, her sleeves rolled and face set. Neither spoke much that day. They didn't need to. They had survived. Now came the slow work of stitching the land, and themselves, back together. The water pump had been shot clean through. Clara took lead on fixing it, melting scrap iron into a crude patch while Eli reset the pipe. He watched her hands work. Quick, sure, stubborn. You ever think about leaving this place? He asked as she hammered a seal into place. She didn't pause. Used to. When I still thought I had something waiting out there. Eli nodded, wiping his brow. And now? She glanced at him, eyes unreadable. Now I know what's worth staying for. The words hung between them like dust in the sun. Eli said nothing, but his hand brushed hers when he passed her the wrench. She didn't pull away. That night, Clara stood at the porch railing, watching the moon rise. Her hair was loose. The desert wind carried the smell of sage and smoke. Eli approached quietly, holding a mug of coffee. I keep thinking, he said, about what Jonas yelled before he ran. She didn't look at him. About not outrunning who you were? He nodded. He's right. I can't change what I did. I rode with killers. I buried silver for men who'd kill over a whisper. And I left you with nothing but my name. You didn't leave me, she said, voice soft. They did. Life did. He set the mug beside her. Still, I brought that war to your door. She finally turned, eyes shining in the dark. And you fought it beside me. They slept in the same house that night, not out of fear but closeness. Eli took the floor. Clara offered the bed. They argued without raising voices until finally she tossed him a blanket and said, You snore louder than a bull. If I wake up, you're moving to the barn. It was the most peace Eli had felt in years. He dreamed of her laughter, something he hadn't heard since they were kids. In the dream, they were back by the creek, sun on the water, her eyes bright and fearless. When he woke, she was already up, stirring beans over the stove, hair tied back. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a ghost pretending to be a man. As the week wore on, the wounds around the ranch slowly closed. They rebuilt the chicken coop, patched the roof, even planted corn. Eli turned over the earth while Clara laid seeds in crooked lines, laughing when he grumbled about her rows not being straight. You try living alone with a broken mule and no plow, she teased. I did, he said. For 10 years. His name was Jonas. She laughed then fully. And he stood there, leaning on a shovel, watching the woman he'd once left behind become the center of his world. That night, Clara pulled out an old tin box from beneath the hearth. Inside were trinkets, a dried blue ribbon, a broken brooch, a rusted ring with a faded stone. She handed it to Eli without speaking. He turned it over in his hand. "I gave you this when I left. You said it meant protection. I was 17 and scared. I didn't know how to say I loved you." She met his eyes. "I wore it until the stone fell out." He swallowed hard. "And after that?" he asked. "I kept it. Because the promise didn't." By the end of the month, Clara had put up a new fence line. Eli had carved a fresh beam for the porch, and they'd started storing dried beans for winter. They didn't talk about love. They didn't need to. Each act, a rebuilt gate, a boiled stew, a mended shirt, was its own declaration. Then one evening, as the sun bled into the hills, Clara stood by the corral and whispered, "What if we tried again?" Eli didn't ask what she meant. He only took her hand, and for the first time in both their lives, neither pulled away. The first real storm of the season rolled in from the west, thunder muttering low like a warning, wind sharp with the smell of rain and memory. Eli stood on the hill behind the cabin, hammering the final crossbeam into a small wooden arch. Beneath it, a freshly dug plot, marked with 2 simple stones. The names carved into them were familiar, ghosts of a past that still lingered. Clara stepped beside him, her skirt flapping in the wind. She carried a single daisy, the last bloom from a pot she'd nurtured on the sill. "They were brothers once," she said, looking down at the graves. "Even in the end." Eli didn't reply. Jonas and Caleb had both been part of his old gang. The fight had ended in blood and silence. Eli had buried them side by side. A final mercy for men who'd long ago run out of second chances. Clara placed the flower gently between the stones. "You buried the war, Eli." He exhaled. "I just ran slower than it did." That night, the storm broke over the desert. Thunder cracked across the horizon. Rain pounded the roof. The two of them sat by the hearth, fire crackling, coffee cups in hand. Outside, the world was chaos. Inside, it was quiet. "You remember the story I used to tell?" Eli asked. "The one about the rider who left his horse behind?" Clara raised a brow. "The one where he had to walk through hell to find her again?" He nodded. "That was never a story," she said. "It was just your way of saying you missed me." He smiled faintly. "It took me too long to learn how to say it right." She reached over, brushing the scar on his cheek with her thumb. "You don't need to say anything," she whispered. "You stayed. That's all I ever wanted." Spring turned to summer. The land changed, slowly, stubbornly. Corn stalks rose crooked but strong. Chickens returned to roost. A new foal kicked its legs beside its mother in the rebuilt stable. Eli dug a new well farther from the broken one. Clara painted the shutters green, because this place has seen enough brown to last a lifetime. They still argued sometimes. He didn't like how she chopped onions. She didn't like how he whistled off-key at dawn. But when he took her hand on the porch swing, the desert quiet again, she'd lean into him without hesitation. And that was everything. One morning, a rider approached the cabin. Dusty coat, rifle slung, eyes tired. Eli stepped out, hand on his belt. The man dismounted and nodded. "You Eli Morin?" "Used to be. Got word down in Perdido. Said you were dead." "I was," Eli said. "Now I'm just fixing fences." The rider stared at him for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned his horse back toward the horizon. Clara watched from the doorway. "He knew you?" "Used to." "Will he be back?" Eli shook his head. "Not unless he's looking for something he can't find anymore." Later that week, Clara handed him a folded piece of paper. Inside was a map, her drawing of the ranch, with little hearts marking spots. Where they first kissed, where she first saw him cry, where the old barn collapsed in laughter after a failed attempt to raise goats. Eli looked at her, confused. She handed him a pen. "Add to it," she said. "Wherever you feel home." He drew a small X beneath the porch swing. "This is where you leaned on me," he said. Clara smiled. Then she took the pen and circled his mark. "This is where I forgave you." That night, He sat watching her sleep, hair fanned across the pillow, breath steady and soft. He had been so many things: a thief, a coward, a man who ran. But here, in this quiet place she'd let him rebuild with her, he was something he'd never dared imagine. He was hers. Not because he'd earned it, but because she'd believed he still could. As dawn lit the edge of the red horizon, Eli stepped outside and looked over the land, scarred, stubborn, beautiful. Once, he'd ridden with the worst of them. Now, he planted seeds with cracked hands and steady faith. The past hadn't vanished. But in her arms, in this outcast haven, it no longer owned him. And in the morning light, he smiled. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a way out. He'd found his way home.